I remember the moment I got that frantic call as if it happened 5 minutes ago. I was in my cramped apartment in Chicago, flipping through channels on a dull Tuesday evening when my phone buzzed. My cousin Patty left a nervous voicemail saying, "You won't believe this, but you need to come home right now. There's an entire construction crew on your inherited farm and they're building like it's their own property." Her voice was trembling, which set my heart racing. I nearly dropped my phone. The phrase "entire construction crew" echoed in my mind. I had inherited a family farm out in Bloomfield, a quiet area in the Midwest, only a few months prior. It was always my grandfather's pride and joy, but I assumed that after he passed away it would remain exactly as he left it. I never imagined there'd be a day I'd rush home because strangers were tearing it apart. I threw a few clothes into an overnight bag, not knowing how long I'd have to stay, and raced off in my battered old car. The entire drive was a blur. I kept asking myself, who in their right mind would build anything, let alone huge houses on farmland they didn't even own? My grandpa's place was about a 3-hour drive from Chicago, so I had time to replay memories. This farm was where I'd spent every childhood summer, chasing fireflies across the cornfields, helping Grandpa feed the chickens, or dozing off under the giant oak tree that stood near the barn. The thought of bulldozers out there, flattening everything he'd worked so hard to maintain, made me grip the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. Patty's call wasn't the kind of thing I could ignore. She was only vaguely aware of the situation, but she mentioned the acronym HOA, which I found puzzling. You don't see many homeowners associations popping up in farmland. HOAs usually exist in suburban neighborhoods or fancy gated communities, regulating everything from fence colors to lawn lengths. There must have been some confusion. I figured maybe some developer had gotten a permit from the local zoning board and misunderstood the property lines. Still, 72 mansions? That number alone was enough to freeze my brain for a second. It was incomprehensible. What kind of project built 72 large houses on farmland without the actual owner's blessing? I arrived in Bloomfield just past midnight. The sky was moonlit but hazy, offering enough light for me to notice how drastically the landscape had changed. There were new roads cut into fields that had once been lush with produce. There were heavy-duty tractors and earth-moving vehicles parked near the old fence line, and the barn was visible only as a shadow in the distance. A few silhouettes wandered among the machinery, either security guards or construction workers on a night shift. It was surreal. I parked a little ways off so I wouldn't attract too much attention and crept closer. When I reached the front gate, an area that used to be a simple wooden fence my grandpa had built decades ago, I noticed a big sign mounted near the entrance. Future site of Pinewood Estates. Pinewood Estates? On Grandpa's farm? My stomach churned. They even named it something vaguely grand, like it was some upscale suburb, not farmland that was part of my family heritage. Feeling a surge of adrenaline, I marched toward the sign, intending to yank it out of the ground. But then a flashlight shone on me. A stern voice asked, "Can I help you?" The man behind the flashlight was middle-aged, wearing a bright orange safety vest. I tried to keep my cool and told him I owned this property. He looked me up and down and said, "That's funny. Diane told us the HOA had complete rights to this land. Who are you again?" Diane? That name rang a bell. Maybe I'd heard it mentioned somewhere in my grandparents' house. I couldn't place it exactly, but the man's question demanded a direct response. I said, "I'm Sam Brooks. My grandfather left me this farm in his will, and I have no idea who Diane is or what she's doing here, but I'm telling you now, this construction has to stop." The man shrugged and answered, "Yeah, well, you're gonna need to talk to her, not to me. I'm just running the night crew." He pointed toward a small temporary trailer set up just beyond the fence line. "That's where the site manager's office is." My pulse was thumping in my ears. On the one hand, I wanted to charge straight into that trailer and demand answers. On the other, it was after midnight, and I wasn't about to pick a fight with an entire group of people who probably believed they were here legally. Besides, I needed to regroup and get my facts in order. I thanked him curtly and headed back to my car. My mind was in overdrive, searching for some explanation of how anyone could possibly think they owned or controlled my land. The more I dwelled on it, the more unsettled I became. I drove into town and rented a motel room for the night, though night was a stretch because I barely slept. The next morning, bright and early, I went straight to see Patty. She lived in a modest house a few miles from Grandpa's farm. She was waiting for me on her porch, wearing a concerned expression. She didn't have children, and her husband, Tom, worked long hours at a local factory, so she was often home alone. She poured me some coffee and filled me in on what little she knew. According to rumors floating around Bloomfield, the local homeowners association, spearheaded by a woman named Diane Rodriguez, had apparently obtained some questionable paperwork that indicated the property lines of the old Brooks farm were different than everyone believed. Instead of farmland, the rumor went, it was designated as a private development zone that had been deeded to the HOA for expansion. That sounded ridiculous to me. My family had lived on that farm for generations. Patty then added, people in town are calling it Diane's big project. She's the president of the local HOA and apparently has connections at City Hall. Some folks say she's unstoppable. I scoffed. No one was unstoppable, especially if they were building on land they didn't legally own. Well, unstoppable or not, I told Patty, I'm putting an end to this. She nodded, but she looked worried. Be careful, Sam, she warned. Diane's not just the typical HOA type. She's got friends in high places. The mayor's niece is married to Diane's son. Rumor is the building permits were rushed through. I swallowed my anger and decided my first step would be to rummage through Grandpa's old records. If I was going to prove that this farmland was indeed in my name, I needed the official deed, the property map, and anything else I could get my hands on. Patty still had the keys to Grandpa's house. He had a small bungalow on the edge of the farm where he lived after he stopped actively running the place, so she handed them over, and I went straight there. Walking into Grandpa's house was a painful experience. His slippers were still in the hallway, and the faint smell of pipe tobacco lingered in the living room. Everything felt frozen in time. If Grandpa had known something like this might happen, I was sure he would have left some clue. I rummaged through drawers, boxes, and cabinets. I found old letters, yellowed photographs, and even a metal tin with decades-old coins. That tin reminded me of something Grandpa had once mentioned to me casually. When I was a teenager, he said, Sam, if ever you need to find out the truth about this place, look for the old iron box I stashed in the barn. At the time, I thought it was just his whimsical way of telling stories. Now it felt like crucial foreshadowing. Clearly, Grandpa had known that someday trouble might come. I decided I needed to check the barn. But before heading out, I found a dusty file cabinet in a corner of the living room. I spent an hour flipping through documents. Most were from decades ago. Tax forms, receipts for seed and fertilizer, sale agreements for some cattle. But then I spotted something interesting. A manila folder labeled Brooks Family Deeds and Survey Maps. My heart leapt. This had to be relevant. Inside there were 3 official-looking deeds, each one referencing different sections of the farmland. One was from the 1920s, another from the 1950s, and the last from the 1970s. There were also some survey maps, though not a single one indicated that the land belonged to anyone but the Brooks family. Everything pointed to full, uncontested ownership. I took pictures with my phone, determined to have digital copies in case anything happened to the originals. Then I decided it was time to check the barn for Grandpa's iron box. If Grandpa had left something there, it might be even more concrete evidence. I grabbed a flashlight and headed across the dusty field. The barn was old but sturdy, a relic that had stood through countless storms and scorching summers. The big, weathered doors creaked as I pushed them open. Inside, the smell of hay and aged wood swirled around. I started combing through every corner. After nearly an hour of searching, I finally found a small locked compartment beneath an old workbench. It was tucked away behind some unused planks. Sure enough, there was an iron box, though it was rusted and looked like it hadn't been opened in decades. When I tried lifting it, I realized it was heavier than expected. I carried it outside, pried open the latch with a screwdriver and lifted the lid. Inside were several documents: a leather-bound journal with my grandfather's initials, and some small Polaroid photos. My hands trembled as I opened the journal. Grandpa's handwriting filled the pages. Some entries were from long before I was born, but as I flipped through, I found more recent notes, some from just a few years ago. He wrote about how he was worried there were people lurking around town who wanted to buy up farmland and develop it. He expressed concern that certain officials in City Hall might be on the take. One entry read, "I overheard talk that Diane Rodriguez is aiming to expand the HOA's territory. She's working angles with the mayor. They want to rezone farmland for luxurious housing. I'm leaving these records behind for Sam. If he ever needs them, they'll be here." The truth is in the official county lines, the original survey from 1901, and the additional wetland protections. They can't build on wetlands. They'll try, but they can't. We have to protect this place. I took a deep breath. So Grandpa had known. He had prepared, leaving these records as a trap of sorts. That meant somewhere in these documents was evidence strong enough to stop Diane and her cronies. I found an old map labeled Wetlands Preservation. It was faint and nearly illegible, but it showed that a sizable portion of the farm was designated as protected wetlands under federal law. That alone could halt any major development, if it was still valid. My heart pounded with excitement. If the farmland included wetlands, not only would I have a legal leg to stand on, but the whole project might be illegal from the get-go. I left the barn feeling both optimistic and uneasy. I had found a potential gold mine of information, but I also realized the fight was bigger than I'd initially thought. Diane wasn't just some random person building houses. She seemed to be at the center of a web of corruption. That night I stayed at Grandpa's house, though the electricity had been turned off. It was dark and musty, but I lit some old candles I found in the kitchen drawers and spent hours poring over Grandpa's journal. Every page gave me a deeper appreciation for how much he loved the farm. He wrote about wildlife migrations, the best times to plant and harvest, and the significance of the wetlands. He also wrote about how the wetlands fed into a nearby creek that eventually joined a larger river system. Building over them would not only be illegal, but it would destroy an entire ecosystem. The next morning, I visited the local clerk's office. The clerk, a cheerful older woman named Linda, recognized me from when I was a child. She asked how I was doing, gave me her condolences about Grandpa, and wondered what had brought me in. I explained there was a rumor that a portion of my farmland had been rezoned or transferred to the HOA. She frowned and typed in some keywords on her computer. After a few minutes, she said she didn't see any official record of a transfer. "Nothing here," she said, furrowing her brow. "At least not in the last 5 years. This property is still listed under your name." She printed out a copy of the record, and sure enough, it showed me as the rightful owner of the entire farm. "So who's building those giant homes out there?" she asked, astonished. I shrugged. "I'm trying to figure that out, but rest assured, I plan to stop it." With the clerk's official document in hand, I felt more confident. But as soon as I stepped out of the office, I nearly collided with a woman in a crisp white blouse, her hair pulled back in a tight bun. She looked at me with narrowed eyes. "You must be Sam Brooks," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "I'm Diane Rodriguez. I hear you've been snooping around." So this was the infamous HOA president. Up close, she looked every bit the formidable figure people had warned me about. Even in broad daylight, she managed to exude a kind of intimidating aura, as though she was used to getting exactly what she wanted. I couldn't help the spike of anger that rose in me, but I did my best to remain calm. "Snooping around? Ma'am, you and your crew are building on my farmland, which you don't own and have no right to develop. So yes, I've been looking into it." She pursed her lips. "That's where you're wrong," she said. "We have a legitimate claim, and if you continue to interfere, you'll be facing legal consequences." She didn't elaborate further, and I sensed this was her classic intimidation tactic. "I have no idea what legitimate claim you think you have," I snapped back. "But I have the official county record, the original deeds, and quite a bit more. This is Brooks' land. Your project is trespassing." She gave a haughty laugh. "We'll see about that. My lawyers will be in touch. Enjoy your day, Sam." And with that, she brushed past me, heels clicking on the polished floor. I stood there, fists clenched, as her perfume lingered in the air. Every nerve in my body wanted to chase after her, demand she explain, but I knew I needed to be strategic. It was time to file my own legal action to halt their construction. That same day, I contacted an attorney recommended by Patty, a man named Richard Grayson. He was a local lawyer with a reputation for tackling tough cases and a genuine passion for protecting small-town values. When I laid out my documents and told him about the farmland, the wetlands, and Grandpa's journal, his eyes lit up. "We've got a strong case here," he said, "but I won't lie. Diane is influential, she's got connections, so we need to be thorough." We spent hours drafting a formal cease and desist letter, which we planned to send to Diane and the HOA. This letter demanded they immediately stop all construction until ownership was clarified in court. Just as we were finalizing the letter, Richard received a call from someone at City Hall. The someone refused to identify themselves, but they hinted that the building permits might have been forged, or at least manipulated. It sounded like a whistleblower. They wanted to stay anonymous, but urged us to check the authenticity of the signatures on those permits. Apparently, the mayor's signature was on one of them, but the date seemed suspicious. My heart hammered. This was bigger than I thought. If the permits were indeed fraudulent, it meant a criminal conspiracy, not just a civil dispute. That same evening, I tried to return to the farm to see what progress had been made. To my shock, the main road that led to Grandpa's bungalow was blocked by a newly installed gate. The sign read, "HOA construction, no trespassing." The gate was locked and there were cameras perched atop tall posts. My property had essentially been taken hostage. Furious, I drove around trying to find another route in. I managed to get close by cutting through a neighbor's field. The neighbor, Mr. Anderson, recognized me from years ago, and he gladly let me park on his land. Then I sprinted through the back boundary. Once I reached the area where they were actively building, I saw piles of gravel, steel beams, and the frames of what could eventually be large mansions. It looked as though they were going full steam ahead, ignoring all possibility they might be stopped. That was when I noticed something else disturbing. A series of deep trenches that seemed to be running right through what I suspected were the wetlands. If this area was indeed protected, the law was clear that you couldn't just bulldoze or drain it. They were changing the topography, diverting water, and likely destroying habitats. My anger bubbled over. I took a bunch of photographs. If we were to prove environmental damage, these would be critical. I also gathered some water samples from the soggy ground. Maybe I'd need them as evidence. In the back of my mind, I could almost hear Grandpa's voice urging me on. That night, as I left the property by sneaking around the gate, I was stopped by a security guard who demanded I identify myself. I told him I was the rightful owner, which he clearly didn't believe. Instead of letting me pass, he radioed someone, and soon a local sheriff's deputy arrived. My heart pounded, worried that maybe Diane had the sheriff in her pocket. But to my relief, the deputy was a man named Davis, an acquaintance of Grandpa. He recognized my last name. I calmly explained my situation, and though he looked hesitant, he let me go. He also told the security guard to step aside. I think he sensed something fishy was going on, but he had to remain neutral because Diane's connections were so extensive. Over the next few days, strange things happened. My phone line was cut off at Grandpa's house. The water, which was from a local well, suddenly stopped running. I discovered that someone had tampered with the pump. I began receiving fines from the HOA in the mail, accusing me of violating their regulations, even though my property shouldn't be under any HOA jurisdiction. It was pure harassment, obviously orchestrated by Diane to make my life miserable and force me to give up. I refused to back down. I alerted Richard and we kept collecting evidence. We found out that some of the fines cited bylaws, that didn't even exist in the county. The entire situation reeked of intimidation. When Patty found out, she rallied some of the neighbors. Many of them had lived in Bloomfield for generations and were appalled by what was happening. A handful of them agreed to come forward and testify that the farmland always belonged to the Brooks family. Mr. Anderson, who let me park on his property, said he'd known my grandpa since childhood and could confirm the real boundaries of the farm. Another neighbor, Ms. Campbell, shared old aerial photographs that showed the farmland's layout and wetlands. Word spread that we were building a coalition to fight the project. I was grateful because I knew I couldn't stand up to Diane alone, not when she had the mayor and various officials in her corner. Tension soared when Richard officially filed our lawsuit. We were seeking a temporary injunction to stop all construction activities until the rightful ownership was determined. We also alleged environmental violations due to the destruction of wetlands. The local media got wind of the story, and a reporter from the Bloomfield Gazette contacted me for an interview. He was a young journalist named Ethan, eager to make a name for himself. He asked me for a statement, and I told him plainly, they're building mansions on farmland they don't own, possibly with forged permits, and they're destroying an important wetlands area. My grandfather left me plenty of evidence to prove it's illegal. Ethan seemed genuinely shocked. He promised to run the story in the next edition. Not 2 days later, the construction site was slapped with an official notice from the County Environmental Office. It wasn't a full stop work order yet, but it was a stern warning about potential wetland violations. Diane, of course, was livid. She called a special meeting of the HOA to address the uproar, but she conveniently labeled it a closed meeting, meaning only HOA members could attend. Since I wasn't part of the HOA, I was excluded, even though the subject matter was literally about my property. That was typical of her. But I heard from a few folks who were inside that she promised them everything was under control and that we have ways to deal with Sam Brooks. That phrase made my blood run cold. Sure enough, within a week, I started getting more official-looking letters, some from the county, some from City Hall, claiming code violations at the bungalow, along with demands for back taxes. Richard and I suspected these were orchestrated by Diane's allies. We'd check each violation and notice one by one disputing them. It felt like a never-ending game of whack-a-mole, designed to frustrate me until I gave up. However, I was more determined than ever. The more they tried to wear me down, the more resolute I became. After a month of back and forth, the court scheduled a preliminary hearing to consider our request for an injunction. The tension in Bloomfield soared. Everyone was talking about it. Neighbors, shop owners, local farmers. The day before the hearing, I got a surprise visit from an older man who introduced himself as Marvin Lewis. He explained he was once a county surveyor and had done extensive work on the farmland. He said, "I heard you might need some help proving those wetlands exist and that the property lines are set in stone." He then handed me a large roll of old survey maps. I kept these for personal records. They show the original boundary lines, wetlands included. I never believed all this talk about the HOA owning that land. My heart nearly leapt out of my chest. This was exactly the kind of hard evidence we needed. Marvin's maps were stamped and dated from decades ago, well before any alleged rezoning could have taken place. As I unrolled them, I saw the official signature of the county surveyor's office. It matched the lines in Grandpa's old maps and the mention of wetlands in his journal. This was the smoking gun. Objective proof that the property lines had not changed and that building on the wetlands was strictly prohibited. I thanked Marvin profusely, fighting back tears. He just gave me a reassuring pat on the shoulder and said, "Your grandpa was a good man. He loved that land. I'm just doing what's right." The morning of the hearing arrived. Richard and I dressed in our best suits. Patty and a dozen neighbors were there to show their support. Diane arrived with her entourage, including a slick-looking attorney from a big city law firm. I could see her scanning the crowd, her eyes landing on me with a mixture of contempt and annoyance. Before the hearing started, her attorney attempted to approach Richard, presumably to discuss some settlement, but Richard politely refused. We knew any settlement Diane offered would likely involve me surrendering most of the land so she could keep building her 72 mansions. That was out of the question. The hearing kicked off with the judge acknowledging the documents we submitted: the deeds, Grandpa's journal entries, the clerk's records, and crucially, Marvin Lewis's survey maps. Diane's attorney tried to argue that their own updated maps proved the land was rezoned, but the judge quickly pointed out discrepancies in their paperwork. The signatures didn't match the official county register, and the dates of approval overlapped suspiciously with times the mayor was out of state. It looked fishy. When the judge examined the environmental concerns, his demeanor grew stern. He asked Diane's attorney, "Are you aware that these wetlands are protected under federal law?" The attorney stammered some excuse about how the wetlands had been reclassified, but the judge wasn't having it. He set another court date for a full hearing, but made it clear that a temporary injunction was on the table. That afternoon, the judge issued a preliminary injunction ordering all construction to halt immediately until ownership and environmental status could be definitively resolved. My supporters and I let out a collective sigh of relief. Diane stormed out, her face twisted in anger. Once outside, she spun around and barked at me, "You've made a terrible mistake. You think this is over? It's not." Then she stalked off. Despite her threat, I felt an overwhelming sense of justice. For the first time since the bulldozers showed up, I believed we could actually win. However, the fight was far from finished. The injunction forced them to pause building, but it didn't automatically tear down the structures they'd already erected. The next step was a full trial, or at least a comprehensive review of all the evidence. Meanwhile, I had to worry about sabotage. Would Diane's crew try to undermine me by tampering with evidence or forging more documents? I stayed vigilant, keeping copies of everything in a safe location. I also updated Ethan, the journalist, on every twist and turn. The media coverage was starting to shift public opinion in my favor. People were outraged by the idea that wetlands could be destroyed so callously. While waiting for the trial date, I took time to reconnect with the farmland itself. Since construction was halted, I could walk around and see the damage they'd done, but I also got to observe pockets of the land that remained untouched. The wetlands were still there, muddy, buzzing with insects, dotted with wild cattails. It was a sobering reminder of what we were fighting to preserve. The local environmental group even reached out, offering support and scientific expertise. They had volunteers who specialized in wildlife studies, ready to testify about the importance of wetlands in flood control and biodiversity. Their enthusiasm buoyed my spirits. Then came a curveball. Diane, through her attorney, filed a counterclaim alleging that I had abandoned the property, making it eligible for some form of adverse possession. It was an absurd claim because farmland doesn't just become abandoned, especially not when it's inherited and the owner pays property taxes. I had proof I was paying those taxes, but it showed she was desperate, throwing everything at the wall to see what might stick. Richard reassured me that her argument was flimsy, but we had to be prepared for any trick. A few days later, I got another surprise. An eviction notice taped to the front door of Grandpa's bungalow. It cited HOA regulations I had allegedly violated. They accused me of having an unkempt yard, unauthorized livestock, and non-compliant fencing. None of it made sense because the farm had existed long before any HOA. It felt like a bad joke. I tore the notice down and stuffed it into a folder labeled HOA harassment. Richard said these tactics were typical in such disputes. They wanted to rattle me, hoping I'd vacate the land. But as frustrating as it was, it only fueled my determination. In the midst of all this, a stroke of luck arrived in the form of an environmental inspector named Sharon Mills. She worked at a regional office and heard rumors about the wetlands being illegally drained. She drove out on her own time to take a look and was appalled at what she saw. She discovered large pipes redirecting water away from the wetlands, which meant the developers were actively trying to dry them out. Sharon took pictures, collected soil samples, and said she'd file a federal complaint if necessary. If they're messing with protected waters, she told me, they're in serious trouble. No judge is going to allow that to continue. Hearing her say that felt like a moment of bright light. But Diane's reach was extensive. A few days after Sharon's visit, the local environmental office that had issued the initial warning seemed to backtrack. They released a statement saying, "After an internal review, we see no immediate violations." I was baffled. How could they say that after Sharon's evidence? Richard suspected Diane had called in favors, pressuring the local office to retract its stance. It was a blatant cover-up. However, Sharon was unfazed and said she would escalate the matter to the federal level if the local officials wouldn't do their job. That gave me hope that justice would eventually prevail. Soon, the day of the big community meeting arrived. It wasn't a formal court session, but rather a public forum organized by concerned citizens of Bloomfield. The mayor had no choice but to attend, given the heated controversy. This meeting would be a chance for everyone to speak, including me, the HOA, local business owners, and environmental groups. The room was packed. People were standing against the walls, eager to hear the argument. I spotted Diane sitting in the front row with a smug expression, flanked by her supporters. The tension was palpable. The moderator introduced the main topic, the questionable development called Pinewood Estates and the apparent farmland ownership dispute. First, a representative from the environmental group gave a brief presentation on wetlands, showing data about how critical they were for local wildlife and flood control. Then the mayor tried to spin the situation as a miscommunication, claiming the city had only intended to expand the tax base. People in the crowd murmured, sensing he was avoiding the heart of the matter. When it was my turn to speak, I walked to the podium, my voice shaking slightly. I held up the old survey maps from Marvin Lewis, the official deeds and Grandpa's journal. I explained how my grandfather had left everything in clear legal standing, how the wetlands had been recognized for decades, and how no legitimate rezoning had ever taken place. I ended with, "I'm not just fighting for my family's legacy, but for all of us who value fairness and the environment. This farm isn't for sale, it never was, and we won't stand by while it's destroyed." The room erupted in applause. Even some people I didn't recognize stood and cheered. I saw Diane roll her eyes, unimpressed. Then Diane took the stage, flipping her neatly styled hair over her shoulder. She insisted the HOA had lawfully acquired the development rights and that my claims were based on outdated records. She tried to sway the crowd by describing the economic benefits of having 72 luxury mansions, which, according to her, would bring new jobs and property tax revenue. She hammered on the point that I hadn't been around for years and claimed I was only interested in stirring up trouble now that money was involved. The crowd reacted with a mix of boos and scattered applause from her diehard supporters. At that point, something dramatic happened. A man from the back row stood up and shouted, "Diane, stop lying!" People turned to see who it was. I recognized him as the same person who had anonymously tipped off Richard about the suspicious permits. He walked to the front of the room, waving some papers. "I work at City Hall, and these are copies of the building permits with the mayor's signature, but the mayor was on vacation in Florida on those exact dates. He never signed these." A hush fell over the crowd. Diane's face went pale. The man handed the papers to the moderator, who looked them over, wide-eyed. The mayor sputtered something about procedural error, but no one was buying it. The meeting erupted into chaos, with people demanding answers and calling for accountability. Another person stood up, a woman who said she worked for the county assessor's office. She proclaimed that the farmland was never rezoned. It was all a sham. I glanced at Diane, who was silent for once, her lips pressed tight. Then Mr. Anderson, my neighbor, came forward with the old aerial photographs, showing the farmland had always included that same boundary and wetlands. He pointed directly at Diane and said, "We've known for years this was Brooks' farmland. You came in here thinking you could bully and bribe your way to building mansions. Well, guess what? You messed with the wrong family." The crowd erupted again in cheers and applause. Even the local TV station's cameraman was focusing on Diane's reaction. By now, Diane appeared visibly shaken. Her carefully curated facade of confidence was crumbling. She tried to defend herself, saying, "This is all a misunderstanding. The HOA never intended to break the law. We relied on the documents we had." But the new evidence presented at the meeting, combined with the residents' testimonies, made her look like a cornered animal. The mayor was heckled loudly, with many demanding his resignation for approving the project or turning a blind eye. Eventually, the moderator had to call for order. Once some semblance of calm returned, the moderator concluded that the new evidence would be forwarded to the city council, the county, and possibly the state attorney general. That night, local news aired a segment on the meeting, showing snippets of me presenting the evidence, neighbors speaking out, and the whistleblowers revealing the forged permits. Diane refused an on-camera interview, and the mayor only gave a brief statement about needing to look into the matter further. The story spread across social media, and soon people from surrounding counties were expressing outrage. The pressure on local officials mounted. Within days, the mayor publicly stated he would fully cooperate with any investigation. Meanwhile, Diane vanished from public view, refusing to attend any more community events. With the public now overwhelmingly on my side, the court date for our trial became almost a formality. Diane's attorney tried one last maneuver, claiming they had new evidence that I was lying about something, but it was easily discredited. The judge, thoroughly fed up, admonished them for wasting the court's time. Eventually, the final ruling was issued. The farmland belonged to me, the permits were invalid, and the wetlands were indeed protected under federal law. The development had to be dismantled, and Diane's HOA could face legal penalties for environmental destruction and fraud. The court ordered a halt to all construction, demanded a restoration of the wetlands, and referred the matter to higher authorities for possible criminal charges against those who forged the documents. In the aftermath, Diane's reputation took a nosedive. The HOA board removed her as president. Some of her allies tried to distance themselves, pretending they had no knowledge of her actions. The mayor faced a formal investigation, and there were calls for a special election to replace him. The incomplete mansions on the farm stood like hollow skeletons, a stark reminder of greed and corruption. Over time, crews came to remove them. While it was sad to see the land so scarred, I also felt immense relief that we had prevailed. I decided to honor Grandpa's memory by restoring the farm to its former glory. I invited an environmental group to help clean up the wetlands and bring them back to health. Many in the community volunteered, planting native grasses and shrubs, removing debris, and helping to ensure the water flow was back to normal. In the process, we discovered that wildlife was already returning. Frogs, ducks, and even a few herons. It felt like a triumph not just for me, but for everyone who believed in doing the right thing. As the dust settled, my cousin Patty asked if I planned to move back permanently. I told her I wasn't sure yet, but the farm would remain in our family just as Grandpa intended. We'd preserve the wetlands, perhaps even open parts of the land to educational programs for local school kids. The idea was to share the history and importance of this place with future generations. In a small ceremony with neighbors, I planted a sapling near the barn in memory of Grandpa. It was a symbolic gesture that life would go on, stronger than before. Before leaving to wrap up some affairs in Chicago, I stood by the old oak tree, the one I used to nap under as a child. A warm breeze rustled the branches, and I felt a sense of calm. Grandpa had left me not only a farm, but a lesson. The real power wasn't in legal maneuvers or political connections alone. It was in knowing the truth, having a community by your side, and standing firm in your conviction. And that leads me to the deeper lesson I'd like to share with all of you watching or listening to this story. Sometimes we think we're too small or powerless to take on people or organizations that seem larger than life. But the truth is that real power lies in the authenticity of your cause and the unity of those who stand with you. No matter how daunting the opponent, no matter how many connections they appear to have, the righteous pursuit of justice, backed by honest evidence and a supportive community, can turn the tide. What Grandpa foresaw all those years ago, that cunning and deceit would eventually reveal themselves, proved absolutely true. When you act with integrity and persevere, you hold all the cards.